is the third seminar today, and it's on air war in Vietnam. And you know, we've spent a lot of time over the years focusing on World War II, but there were a lot of amazing things that happened in Korea, a lot of amazing things happened in Vietnam, and continuing in the Gulf Wars. And so it's important that we recognize these things. And so today, like I said, the program is Vietnam Air War. We have three veterans: Jolie Burns, who flew F-4s, Chuck DeBellevue, who also flew F-4s, Chuck Burin, who flew an F-4 Skyhawk, and then served as an air controller in Vietnam too. Well, multiple tours here. I think it represents 1, 2, or 5 tours in Vietnam here. So, Chuck Burin, why did you want to be a pilot? Why did you get into aviation?
I got into aviation, actually when I was a young kid. I used to know who all those people whose streets were named after on the roads. I remember those names. I went to ROTC, University of Kansas. Went out on a destroyer my first summer as a midshipman cruise, and decided that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I decided I'd be a Marine, and then I took a flight training program through the Navy. Ended up going to flight training in 1963, got my wings in '64. Went from there to Cherry Point, North Carolina to get training in the A4 Skyhawk. My first 7 months of training was to learn how to drop nuclear weapons. And then they got ready to send me to Vietnam, so I was well prepared.
Jolie Burns, you were in the Air Force, and what inspired you to want to be a pilot, to want to be in the Air Force?
Well, the Air Force part was, I needed to get accepted into a school that would pay my scholarship, or I wasn't going to go to college. So my dad knew some people. My dad knew some people, and he got me interested in applying for the academies. And he said, "Son, you don't want to go in the Army, and you don't want to go in the Navy. The Air Force has it easy." And I was lucky enough to get an appointment to the Air Force Academy, and when I came out of there, I was at the Air Force Academy. I was supposed to go fly. I'm pretty sure that's what it was all about. And being an athlete, I thought I could fly. I thought I could learn to fly. And it took a while, but it wasn't natural necessarily to me, but I learned how to fly and got comfortable flying, and then I got the hook. I wanted to fly all the time. That's how I got it.
You were a late convert to it. Chuck DeBellevue, what about you? You were coming in a little bit later. Vietnam was going in high gear when you were going to college. What prompted you to want to be a pilot?
Well, when I was in high school, I didn't want to be in Boy Scouts. I joined Civil Air Patrol instead, and flew missions with them, and worked around airplanes, and got to love it. And saw the Thunderbirds when they were flying F-100s. I want to do that. So the bug was bit me, and I came through ROTC in college and got my permission and came in the Air Force.
Okay. Jolie Burns, what was talk about your training a little bit. How extensive was it? How long was it? Where was it?
You mean F4 training, right?
Well, your pilot training in general. Yeah.
Well, pilot training was at the Reese Air Force Base. It is closed, of course, now. So many of the bases I was at are closed. But flew the T-37 and the T-38. And somewhere in the T-38, things started to click for me, and I really started feeling comfortable. And the training in the Air Force is like the training in any other military service. You learn it by repetition, and it pays off well in combat. So,
okay. Chuck Burin, as a Marine, where was your training and what was it?
Our training is the same as the Navy training and the Coast Guard pilot training. I started off in Pensacola, Florida, flying the T-34s, went to Marine, Mississippi in T-2 Buckeyes, Came back to Pensacola for a grand total of 23 days in Training Squadron 4, and that's where we went out and landed on a carrier for the first time on the USS Lexington. From there, I moved out to Kingsville, Texas, and in fact, 50 years ago at this time, I was in Kingsville learning how to fly the TF-9J Cougar.
Okay, now just let me stop you there for a second. Most of us have seen film footage of people landing on a carrier. Okay, some people have described it as a postage stamp in the middle of the ocean. So what's that experience? How were you prepared for that? What was that experience? And then go on with the other things.
Well, we spent a lot of time practicing carrier landings at a field set up over at Bekke Air Force Base. We would go over there and have a landing signal officer and a deck painted out on the runway, and we would practice landings, and they would call us. The aircraft were equipped with a system that the LSO on the ground could tell when you had the proper angle of attack and airspeed and that to come down and make the landing. There were about 15, 20 days of that, and they sent us out to the ship. Usually went out in a flight of 4 students, and you had an instructor watching overhead. But you went out solo, went to the boat, you made 4 landings, 4 catapults, and don't remember any of it when you're finished. After I finished my time in the F9, I went back to the boat again. This time it was the USS Intrepid, which is up in New York City these days, as a museum. Seems everything I flew or been on was a museum now, including me. But landed on the Lexington. In fact, I had problems with the F9. We flew from Kingsville, Texas to Cecil Field in Jacksonville, Florida. I went out to the boat the first time, and the landing hook caught in what they call a stinger position. It was straight out behind the plane, and it wouldn't drop for some reason. It wouldn't come down. So I made a couple of touch and goes because the hook didn't come down. They really weren't bolters. It was touch and goes. We were trying to shake the hook loose. Sent me back to Cecil, pushed the hook back in place, rechecked it, and sent me out, and I got my landings the second time around. The last month of flight training at that time in the Navy and Marine Corps involved flying the same airplane that the Blue Angels were flying at that time, the F-11 Tiger. So we're students, we go out there for the first time we fly the airplane. They didn't build any 2-seat Tigers. They were all single seat. So you went out on one day and you taxied the airplane around to see what it felt like, and the next day you went out and flew it into the air. I spent about a month in that squadron, got my wings, then went on to Cherry Point, North Carolina from there.
Okay, Chuck DeBellevue, for your training, where did you go and what did you train on?
Well, initially I started out as an nav and did some training at Mayfair, then went down to Davis Mountain to check out the F4. When I came out of Southeast Asia, I went to pilot training at Willie, and as a backseat in the F4 in Southeast Asia, when I left to go to pilot training, I was landing current in the airplane, which most places you can't land from the backseat because they don't let you. I was current in the refueling from the backseat, and felt fairly comfortable in the airplane. When I got to pilot training as a young captain, I had to salute my second lieutenant IP, which didn't last that long. And sort of fell into place in the T-37, and then got to 38, which I thought was just a small F4, and found a home.
And now, when you found out you were going to F4s, were you happy about that? That was what you wanted to do?
In those days, we picked based on class standing, and I was, at the time I was selected, I was #1 in the class, and picked the F4.
Okay. And what about the two of you? Did you get the flying assignments that you wanted? Type of aircraft?
I was wanting to fly the F-100 out of pilot training, but I didn't quite graduate high enough in my class. So the last F-100 that was available went to the guy in front of me. So I didn't get that, but they wanted me at that time to be a T-38 IP to come back as what we call a FAPE. But I told them I really wanted to fly fighters, and I would take an F-4 backseat pilot assignment just to get my foot in the door. And although flying in the backseat as a pilot was a little painful and hard to get used to, it was the best thing that I could have done.
And for you?
I ended up actually wanted to fly F-8 Crusaders. That would have been my aircraft of choice. Unfortunately, they were all at Beaufort South Carolina, and I was at Cherry Point, North Carolina. Reported in to Air Group 14 there, which happened to have A6s, just starting out with A6s and A4s, and was fortunate to get the A4 Skyhawks. Again, there were no two-seat A4s in those days, so it was right into the cockpit, right off the flying.
Okay, Joey Burns, you went to Southeast Asia in '65, first tour 65, 66. Things are just cranking up over there. What was the attitude in the squadron? What were people talking? What were they thinking? What's going on in Vietnam? What's happening here?
Well, it was very early, of course, in Vietnam, and I would have to say that there wasn't a lot of information or knowledge about what it was really going to be like when we got there. We were replacing a TDY squadron that you buy with us coming over as a PCS squadron. So they left and said, gave us about 3 hours worth of briefings, and they left on the airplane, and then we had to figure the rest of it out ourselves. Our mission at that time was flying night patrol of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, usually with a FAC or one of these spookies gunships to guide us to a target. Other times we did armed recce and found it ourselves.
Okay, and Chuck Burns, you came in at 66.
That's correct.
And you were assigned to be stationed with where?
I was at the air base at Chu Lai, living in a tent, having artillery go off about 500 meters away from us every night, firing harassing and interdiction rounds, and nobody told you about it because they wanted to see what your reaction would be the first time the 8-inch gun fired and scared the hell out of you. Lived in a tent there. The only advantage we had was we were living right on the beach. Nice Southeast Asia beach, sand beach, a lot of sun. We had Vietnamese fishermen that used to fish out in the cove out in front of the place, and they would sell us stuff. So even though we were half the time eating bee rations, which are not the best things to be having because the supply group couldn't get down from Da Nang, we did have fresh seafood quite a bit down there. Missions out of Chu Lai. We had four A4 squadrons operated out of there, a 5th squadron in Japan, which we rotated among the squadrons every 8 weeks. Our missions were generally in South Vietnam supporting the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions. However, of the 88 missions I flew before I got transferred to division, 33 of them happened to be in a country we weren't even in called Laos. My second mission was to drop leaflets over a little place called Chapone, and went in there, and I was flying the wing, and my lead said, "I'll be observing you from higher altitude. I want you to go down this valley at about 450 knots, pull straight up, and push the button to blow the plugs out of those tanks that are carrying the leaflets." And as best I can figure, I probably ended up with two piles of leaflets on the ground right underneath where the airplane pulled up. And then we headed back over to Chu Lai. Flew a lot of night missions over there also. Flew what we call night TPQ, which was a radar bombing mission. And Marines had a number of TPQ sites. And the A4, you'd fly at about 30,000 feet, and they would lock onto you. You push a button, and the guy on the ground would fly the airplane for you, tell you when to turn the arming switch on, how many bombs he wanted, and then he would actually drop the bombs for you, and you would tell him to come off the plane, switched it off, and headed back to the base again.
You talked about dropping leaflets, and you said they went down in 2 piles. There was a problem in Vietnam with the leaflets being packed on the ground where it's very humid, flying up very high in the plains where they froze into a solid block, and then coming out as a block of paper.
That's not a problem when you're down about 200 feet above the ground.
Okay, so you were doing low-level work.
Yes.
Okay, so that's not what we were talking about. It reduces the effectiveness when they come out of the block.
Unless you can hit something with it.
Well, yeah. Pinpoint targeting. Talk about the early missions, the types of anti-aircraft fire you might have encountered. Were they shooting at you with guns? Were there any missiles at that point? What was the enemy reaction to what you were doing?
The majority of in South Vietnam, our missions there for the division, we normally, the biggest thing was fired at you, it might be a 51 caliber, the same as our 50. There weren't any missiles there at the time, there weren't any big guns there at the time. even in Laos in 1966, at least where we were flying, probably the biggest thing that would be fired at us might be a 37 millimeter. They really hadn't moved the big stuff down there yet. Maybe some 23, I don't recall seeing that much of it. Of course, in an A4 fighter, you don't always see the stuff being fired at you. The forward air controller who you're working with will usually tell you if someone's been shooting at you, as I learned later on when I did that kind of mission.
And Jolie, did you?
I just have one comment. You were talking about the automatic bomb drop and everything. Did they have a nickname for that?
Not that I don't, there may have been, I don't recall.
We did. We called it Sky Puke.
From the original name Sky Spot, right?
I don't know Sky Spot.
So what kind of anti-aircraft or anti-aircraft fire or any resistance did you encounter early on?
Well, we did, recce up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it depended on where you were, how much AAA you got. Most of it was 37, and we really tried really hard to stay away from Chapone because that's where the good gunner was. He was deadly if you weren't paying attention. He could shoot you, he could hit you. But that was most of it. But occasionally, when we were going up, what's the name of that valley up north of Asho? No. Mugia Pass, thank you. They, on occasion, would drag a SAM down there and fire it off on a Mugia Pass, which is pretty impressive at night. Big flame comes up and, it's like fireworks, except they're shooting at you. So it was pretty interesting. And in some of the parts of that valley, if you were getting down low because you were trying to find the targets or trucks in the pass, they would be shooting from light armament, but shooting down from the mountains on either side at you, which was uncomfortable feeling for some reason.
And talk about evading a missile.
Evading a missile at night is much different than during the day. It's easier to keep track of, but you don't necessarily know really where it is. You can see the streak, but you can't tell how far it is. You can't tell if it's turning or if it's, going straight. So you're just flashing around and doing everything to try to make sure it's not tracking. But you're not really reacting against the missile, actually.
And targets that you were going against on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, what were you looking for? What could you see below? People, what's the vision of the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Is it a 4-lane highway? Is it a little dirt track? Were you seeing people pushing bicycles? Did you see trucks? I have a friend that was in a Marine Reconnaissance Battalion, and he said one day they saw camouflage painted elephants going down the trail.
I don't doubt that. But it was usually camouflage trucks, and they did have a lot of vegetation on them. But occasionally, I don't know what it was, if you were flying along, you could see a difference in color between the camouflage and the jungle canopy. And if you did, of course, you popped up and came back around and tried to get bombs on them. And usually they started moving when you did that. So then you had a better idea of where they were and tried to hit them. And again, it's at night, but sometimes the starlight is actually bright enough to see things on the ground, if you can believe that. And sometimes we had our own flares that we would think we saw something, we'd drop a flare, and then come back around and be able to see the trucks through our own flare light, and then we drop them.
And what about tracers at night? You could see the missiles coming up, but what about tracers?
It's about every 5th or 6th round is a tracer. And so there's a string of them and they come up. And if it stays in one place on your canopy, you're in trouble. So you want it to be, you turn so that the line of tracers is moving back one way or the other on your canopy. If it stays in the same place, it's coming toward you. So it's not moving laterally. So in many respects, it was easier to evade gunfire at night because of the tracers.
Yeah, one of the things I learned later on, afterwards is that the ballistics on the tracer were different than the ballistics on the bullet itself. So you always wonder if you saw tracers, where are the real bullets going?
And Chuck, you were flying late in the war, and the anti-aircraft fire was probably a lot more concentrated. What was your experience with the missiles and with anti-aircraft fire?
Well, they had a very integrated air defense system. They could integrate their surface air missiles in with their AAA and with their MiGs. And we saw 23 millimeter, 37 millimeter, 57 millimeter, 85 millimeter in the aircraft in North Vietnam. SA-2s and then big 19s and 21s. The Navy saw 17s, but I didn't see any of those. And if you're in a dogfight, as soon as the MiGs were gone or destroyed, the AAA would come up. So you had to be on the lookout all the time. At night you could see the tracers. During the day, it didn't scare you quite as much.
Is that because ignorance was bliss? You couldn't see them as well?
Yes.
Now,
if you can't see him, he can't see you. It doesn't work.
just put your hands over your eyes and it's all better.
Now the SAMs, if they fired SAMs at you, you could look at the SAM. If it was not moving on your canopy, it was yours. You got to do something. If it was moving on the canopy, it was your buddy's. He has to do something. And that's hard to train for. There's no peacetime training program for that. It's all OJT. And if you don't learn quick, it doesn't matter.
And within the unit, the more experienced pilots help you out with these things as you were, did they have OJT or were you strictly on your own?
You weren't strictly on your own, but there was a lot of OJT going on, and you flew in a low threat area until you got more experienced, and then you would start going into higher threat areas. For the missions into Hanoi that we flew, for our air-to-air missions, we handpicked who flew with us. On your first ride that you got with us, you got your check ride. If you passed it, you got your ride number 2. If you didn't pass it, thanks a lot. No, we don't need you.
And how about for you? How were you prepared for combat missions when you got to country?
We did our briefings. We did 2-plane, 3-plane, 4-plane missions, a lot of hot pad alert. For some reason, the A4s could get in the air faster than the fighters, the F4s and the F8s. And I had two missions in particular that the A4 was not really suited for. I got launched as a wingman. As a lieutenant, I was usually always the wingman. We got launched to fly from Chuai to Da Nang, 3 miles from Da Nang airfield, out where the MAF headquarters was in May of 1966, when the Vietnamese army were fighting each other in one of the coups that was taking place. And we were launched to go up there and fly orbits over top of a couple of Vietnamese Sky Raiders who were making runs on their own people on the ground who were on the wrong side of the coup. Now, why they would launch A4s with rockets on them against a couple of Sky Raiders, I'll never know, but we got it. The second minute, by the way, the F8s finally made it off and replaced us after about 30 minutes. And they said they were 3 miles away. The second time I got launched off the hot pad was an incoming bogey coming off of, I think they said Hainan Island, I found out later, heading toward Da Nang. Nobody knew what it was. Again, we got launched out of Chuai carrying rockets. I think we had Zuni rockets and our 2 20mm cannons, and they vectored us out off the coast of Vietnam, climbing up to altitude to intercept what we found out was a Northwest 707. And we climbed up on it and approached it and said, guys, it's a commercial airliner. It's got a red tail on it. We think it belongs to Northwest. Can we go home now? And the guys at the Hawk site down at Monkey Mountain said, okay, you can go home. We know what it is. His IFF finally started working. So again, 2 missions that the A4 was just not suited for, but we got launched because we'd get in the air within 5 to 10 minutes.
And how were you prepared for combat when you got in country? Did they start you out on the slower missions, the safer missions, or you thrown right into it?
No, there was a build-up. We did, what we called milk run missions, where you would go out in a low threat area and usually working with a forward air controller or somebody to kind of point you in the right direction while you were learning. And then as time went on, then you would get the missions where you didn't really have a fact, but you had target coordinates or something you needed to go look at and do a visual reconnaissance on it. And then they would tell you if you were cleared to drop or not. And you went a little further north, quite a bit. And we'd go up into northern Laos sometimes where it was pretty hot, and even at night they had a lot of AAA up there, and I don't know if they were aiming at us, but they were sure filling the sky.
One of the things about most of the Marine Corps missions, I said our primary job was to support the division, so we're supporting the troops on the ground. So we did not drop without positive control from either an airborne forward air controller, and it might be an Air Force one at that time. We had very few Marine Corps O1s at that time. Or it might be a forward air controller on the ground who had been trained to do that, who's out at battalion level on it. In Laos, we always worked with the Air Force forward air controllers over there. At that time, they were flying the O1s, usually out of NKP, the Crickets and those folks over there.
Now, 170 years ago, locomotives started, and they were going to go 30 miles an hour. And people were afraid to ride on them because they thought they'd suffocate, because no one could withstand going 30 miles an hour. When you're driving down the freeway, anybody ever have a brain dead moment and drive past the exit because you're going 70 miles an hour? You guys were flying at 500 miles an hour, roughly, at an elevation often of not very much, somewhat above the trees, below the tops of the hills on your sides. How come you didn't crash into things? How come you didn't just miss everything below you? How does a human being deal with that kind of speed?
But the mind is a wonderful thing. If you train it right, it keeps up with you. When I was flying with a high-speed FAC, we used to start the missions in the McGee and Mankarai passes at 625 knots calibrated, roughly about maybe 700 miles an hour. The first day I did it, everything was a blur. The second day, not quite as much. Third time I did it, you could pick out troops here, trucks there, and after that, your mind's running at 800 miles an hour, so you're up ahead of the airplane.
And how about for you?
Well, in the A4, with the ordnance we normally carried, you were speed limited anyhow. You weren't going to go anything over about 425 to 450 with what we had on.
Slow, right?
No.
150 miles an hour?
But most of ours, we weren't doing any low-level recce yet. When we went out on a mission, it might have been a helicopter support mission, it might have been a pre-planned target, and we really didn't concern ourselves too much with what we were looking at on the ground, because we had a forward air controller who was telling us where he wanted us to put the weapons. And so you listen to them, and in the briefing they tell you what heading they want you to use, they tell you what the elevations in the area are, so you know how high the mountains are around the area. They tell you if you get hit, what the direction you want to go to find a safe area to eject if you have to. So they gave you a lot of information to help you out on these things. Like I said, when I did nuclear weapons training, yeah, that was at 200 feet and 450 knots. But in actual combat, we stayed quite a bit higher than that. Now, napalm runs were lower in order to be effective and all. But we always we're working with somebody else who was helping to look out for you. Plus, I was usually the wingman too, so.
And Jolie, in your F4, how was it for you getting used to that?
It's like we do step-down training. We do go fast and low, but low at some point is 500 feet above the ground. And then you move down to 400 and 300, and we don't want to say that we went any lower than that, but occasionally you would, for one reason or another. And it is a learning thing to where your eyes perceive things better after you practice over and over again going that fast, that low.
Now, aerial refueling is another one of these things that people who haven't done it, at least to me, has always seemed kind of amazing. Chuck, do you want to talk about, I know you did quite a bit of it, I think, and talk about the experience of refueling your jet at how fast and how close to this tanker?
Well, you actually just fly in formation off the tanker. First time you do it, you're nervous because you got to be pretty precise, because in the F4, the refueling receptacle is behind the back seater. So the boom comes in over your head, and you want to make sure that the boomer doesn't get too nervous. So you fly in formation. If you get too close, he doesn't like that. If you get too far away, it pops out. If you get too close and low, you can take the boom home. That's not good. So you basically just got to be flying formation. The first time you do it, you got a death grip on the stick. After you do it a couple times and you get comfortable, you fly it with your fingertips. And if the tanker rolls inverted, you roll inverted with it. You stay in position.
Another day on the job, right?
That's right.
We did refueling from C-130s primarily with a basket system out of Chulai. We practiced back in the States doing it with A4s with what they call a buddy storage, the fuel drogue system underneath the center line of the aircraft. But in the combat area, a lot of times at Chulai, because of the situation at the airfield there was built on sand, we'd only have half a runway to use, 4,000 feet rather than 8. So we would launch with light fuel and use JADO units to take off, and then immediately climb up and hit a tanker, which would be a Marine C-130, and then go on to the mission from there. And in fact, we also at Chulai had an arrested landing system we could use also on the crosswind runway for the same thing again. And then when we had 4,000 feet there, usually came in and made an arrested landing on it.
And for you?
Again, it's the flying formation, and they really do have good lights on the belly of the tankers. Again, we were the plug-in type, and it'll tell you if you're in position. And then on the refueling boom, it kind of went in and out, and it had a series of colors, which were green in the middle, so you were right exactly where you needed to be distance-wise. And then it was yellow, and then red. Red was not good, so you had to really be careful to keep it kind of in the green or just on the edge of the yellow. But again, it's something that you learn to be smooth, and it wasn't a big deal. Unless, of course, there's turbulence or the guy has to do a big turn or something all of a sudden. That makes it exciting.
Okay, Chuck Burin, you, second part of your first tour, you were doing air controlling. And you want to talk about what that was and what you were doing specifically?
Well, the second half of my life, before I went over to Vietnam, I went to Little Creek, Virginia, and they made me a forward air controller. In Marine Corps, you had two kinds of forward air controllers. You had a FAC, a forward air controller, and that meant you were on the ground, stationed with the ground folks, and you weren't flying anything. The other one was a FAC-A, FAC and an A in parentheses, which was an airborne FAC. My job, after I flew the A4s for a while, is I got sent to the 3rd Marine Division since I had prior training, and took over the Air Naval Gunfire Platoon, and we were in charge of some beacons that the ships used to radar range themselves so they could do naval gunfire. I also did a lot of convoy duty between Da Nang and Dong Ha, moving the Marine Division, the 3rd Marine Division from Da Nang to Phu Bai in late 1966, and then moving a bunch of Army equipment, convoys of as many as 120 trucks in them, and I was the forward air controller in a Jeep with my driver, a whole bunch of radios, talking to my good buddies who were up above me, flying convoy escort for us, and giving me hell because I was sitting on that Jeep on the ground in the middle of the convoy. I did that for a number of months. Part of the other duties I had there was assigned to the Fire Support Coordination Center, working with the aerial observers and the artillery folks on planning missions. I also had a small job of developing the messages for the targeting boxes for the B-52s for the arc light strikes, and I did that for a number of months also. I also managed to make a trip up to Quezon before anything else happened up there. A couple of C-130s, I was getting some flight time. Above ground, everything was above ground. This was in December of 1966, before everything hit the fan up there. And basically, Marines had a reinforced company there at the time. Again, an interesting time, a chance to do some flying. I also got some time in H-34 helicopters. I had some time in the 01 Charlie Bird Dog, the Marine Bird Dogs we were using at the time, which was a little bigger engine version of the airplane that everybody else was flying, the A models at the time.
Okay, and Chuck, your first tour was 66, 67, and you came back in 69 and 70. And did you see, what kind of changes did you see, if any, in Vietnam and the Marine Corps?
Well, by the time I volunteered to go back. I had been a flight instructor in Meridian, Mississippi in T2s, and I was getting tired of students trying to kill me, so I decided to go back to Vietnam. I knew who was after me over there. I had volunteered to fly the OV-10 Bronco, fairly new aircraft at the time. I went back and did training at Camp Pendleton. I went to Vietnam in July of 1969. Flew a mission, one mission over there with an observer in the back seat, not a pilot, observer, and then started flying combat missions after that. Probably the biggest thing I noticed was a lot of the areas that we controlled or had bases and things at when I left in 1967, we no longer had bases with people at. Quezon, Cam Duck, a number of places like that, which we either surrendered or turned over to the enemy. I also got there at the time when the Marine Corps started withdrawing squadrons, and a number of our squadrons were in fact leaving country. The big buildup was, I guess, what, late 68, early 69, we started downhill from there. But I did spend the whole year flying the OV-10 Bronco as a forward air controller airborne. Missions were primarily within close proximity to the base at Marble Mountain, and then Da Nang, we moved there later on. When you took off, you were in the operating area, as opposed to some of the Air Force forward air controllers flying out of NKP, Pleiku, and places like that, who had to fly somewhere to get to their missions. Our normal missions were about 2 hours, scheduled for 2 hours and 15 to 2 hours and 20 minutes. No centerline tank, internal fuel, carrying smart marking rockets for smoke, HE rockets for close support if we needed to use them. We had a 20mm cannon on the centerline later on. We also had 4 M60 machine guns, 2 in each sponson that we used for ground support. Now the general didn't like us doing that. From the wing general didn't think little green airplanes ought to be doing what his jets were doing. But again, normally we were able to we were on scene, we were already there. And when the recon folks are in trouble, or when the troops are in trouble on the ground, the company's in trouble, you're going to provide the support you have to support for them right then and right there. We got shot at, and again, a lot of small arms fire. All the missions in country that we flew were no more than 20, 30 miles from Da Nang, so we were actually in the area the whole time. We also did artillery spotting. I dropped sensors, seismic sensors from the aircraft. Just a lot of different types of things, convoy escort missions, anything you can think of, we would do it. And an airplane normally between 1,000 and 1,500 feet above the ground with no air conditioning in it in the middle of the summer in Vietnam.
Okay, so your missions were in Vietnam, a lot of it was close air support. Chuck DeBellevue and Joe Lee, you were flying F4s out of Thailand, and what was your relationship to air controllers, or were your missions briefed ahead of time and then you just went and flew them? What was your relationship?
Okay. When I came back the second time, I was at Da Nang, and we flew out of there primarily close air support missions in I Corps. And those were really, really fun missions. Plus we got to fly sometimes 3 times a day, which was just great. It was really fun. And we'd take off, and we'd have to wait for our fuel in our external tanks to burn down before we could roll in and drop bombs, because otherwise you got a little dicey in the pitch control. The daylight close air support missions are really demanding but really fun, because you have to visually put the weapons where the fact says, and if you mess up and go long or left or right, which doesn't usually happen, but long or short, you're going to be dropping on friendlies. That's not good. So that was what it was like out of Da Nang. When we went to Korat, our mission changed considerably in that we were going into North Vietnam, and quite often in Rupat 5 and 6 up around Hanoi and Haiphong. And those, of course, are big deal missions. 16 bombers, 12 air-to-air escorts, all the refueling tanker support, and it's a big, massive effort, and it's cumbersome, but it's very effective if you can get the bombs on target.
And Chuck DeBellevue, for you, flying out of Thailand, Again, were your missions pretty much briefed ahead of time, and that's what you did, or did you work with air controllers?
Early on, we did a lot of briefing of air-to-ground missions, but we worked a lot with facts. We pre-briefed on what the general terms of the briefing the mission was going to be, but once we got on target and the fact pointed out the targets to us, we would strike the targets. Later on, I became a high-speed fact. The difference between a slow fact and a high-speed fact is about 600 knots. And we operated only in North Vietnam, and we were not afraid to go into the flats near the coast. It was extremely dangerous, but we operated there day in and day out. Did that for a while, and then I did air-to-air up in North Vietnam, up in the area in and around Hanoi. We flew every day. Most of our intel came from us, because we flew every day. And we handpicked on the high-speed fact missions and on the air-to-air missions, we handpicked the crews that flew those missions. And if you were, you got up and said, I had a bad night last night, I didn't go with you. You said, I don't feel lucky today, I didn't go with you. You know, you had to have complete trust in all the guys that were flying with you. And if you didn't, it wasn't going to work out. The missions, air-to-air missions, you had to understand that you were going into the heartland of the enemy and that you were expendable. If you didn't come back from the mission, it was somebody else going in your place tomorrow, and I knew who that guy was. And if you didn't come back tomorrow, I knew who the guy that was replacing him the day after. If you were worried about dying, perhaps you would do something else a little bit.
And flying over North Vietnam all the time, you've heard stories of POWs sitting in Hanoi for 6 years at that time. And did you guys talk about that, the possibility of that situation?
No.
Okay.
And I didn't mind dying for my country, but we hadn't been able to get those guys out of the prison camps, and some of them were there for 6, 7, 8 years. I had no desire to get taken prisoner. The F-4 was a great airplane. It took a lot of damage, never saw it blow up. So if you got an engine fire, put it in burner and head out to the ocean. When the engines melt, get out of it. But I wasn't sticking around. You know, it's didn't think about it much. I figured if that bullet or that SAM had my name on it, it was mine. If it didn't, you can blow it off. You don't worry about it. Slept good every night.
Jolie, you were flying up about the same time?
Yes.
And you had one bad day. One particularly bad day. And
I forgot about that.
And also, leading into that, did you guys, again, did you guys talk about the possibility of being a POW? Did that weigh on your minds?
No, because you couldn't let it. I mean, we thought about it some, and we had maybe brief discussions. We knew pretty accurately that they were getting the hell tortured out of them. And we wanted to, you know, so we wanted to avoid that at all possible. And I need to stop and do one thing. We were talking about not having good air conditioning in our airplanes when they were down at low altitude. Well, one of the things we had to do in those helmets, they had Velcro pads put in them, and you didn't have a skull cap to wear. So in the 35th Squadron, we got these things, and we wore them like headbands, like hippies back there. But this kept the sweat from coming off your head down into your eyes when you're pulling these, because that's not good either if you can't see. So we wore these under our helmets all the time.
Yeah, the OV-10, of course, we had no air conditioning, so we were flying around down low. I think our flight surgeon did a study on one of the missions in the summer of 1969. Just waited a pilot before he went out, waiting when he came back, and I said a 2-hour and 15-minute mission. He'd lost 10 pounds. Plus, during that time, he had finished 3 canteens of water. So it got a little bit warm in the cockpit. One of the other things I want to mention is there's a difference in what, if you talk to Air Force people that flew OV-10s, particularly if it was in Laos and that, their altitudes that they flew were much higher than ours, but there was a reason for that. That was the weapons that were being fired at them. In country, we were at 1,000 feet, maybe sometimes lower, 1,000 to 1,500, so we could see what was going on. We were working with troops on the ground, whether it be recon or whether it be regular troops. The folks over in Laos and that, and some of the other areas where they were flying at 4,000 feet to 4,500 feet a lot of times in their OV-10s. So it's interesting when you get to some of the reunions and you talk to some of these folks, and it's like you were in two totally different wars. They were going back to NKP at night, going to the club and that, never getting rocketed or mortared while you're in the club trying to have dinner. Denying that and Marble Mountain, that was usually a regular thing every other week or so. You'd have an alert that the bad guys were going to shoot rockets, which was another mission we had. It was called Rocket Patrol around Da Nang, which was, again, not the smartest mission around because they set the rockets up to fire on timers. So all you'd see was we could call Da Nang and say, the rockets are on the way, guys. And they said, you want us to fire artillery where they came from? I said, I don't know why, there's nothing left, the rockets are all gone.
Okay, Jolie, do you want to talk about your bad day?
Oh yeah, I guess I have to. Well, I ended up through a series of things that you normally don't like to have happen during a briefing for a mission. So I ended up being the lead. I started out as being number 3 in the lead 4-ship as the alternate mission commander, and everybody in front of me aborted for one reason or another. So I'm the lead. I have a ground spare that briefed with us, and then I have a spare from another flight carrying different ordnance that we didn't brief. So, but we're going on the mission. I've got the 12 other F4s behind me with bombs, and behind them are like 8 others with the CBUs, and we're going up 12 miles southeast of Hanoi to hit an underground fuel system. You know, they're hard to see when they're underground. But we did have pretty good intelligence where the roads were and everything, and so we, you know, I could see where the target area was. They were burning the field, so you could see the wind blowing, the smoke going in a certain direction. That helped us aiming our bomb. So I see them, I pull up, and one's in, pull down real hard, get all lined up, going about 600 knots straight down, 60 degrees dive, picking the bombs off, and they come off, and we pull off left, pull off right, and then come back around, heading out to the east, north of Thud Ridge. And I looked back over my shoulder, and I could see fire and smoke coming up from where our bombs and the bombs from the guys behind me went off. So we knew we hit the target. I mean, it was impressive. So there was fuel there on the ground. Absolutely was. So we're coming back out, and I'm decided to go low because there was a deck of clouds in between. If they had shot SAMs, I would not have been able to see them until they came through the clouds and only had 5,000 or 6,000 feet of warning to try to get out of the way. So I elected to stay low. And we were going really fast, 500 knots or so, and kind of going up and down over ridgelets that ran north and south off of Thud Ridge. And I miscounted the ridges, so I come up over the last ridge that I'm thinking about, okay, now I'm going to call burner and climb, and I look out and I see the water. I see the coastline about 12 miles ahead of me, and I go, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. And I look over at my right, 2 o'clock, and I see a 57 millimeter gun emplacement. It's got the rubber wheels folded up under it. It's on its little pads, and it's shooting, and it's coming up and down. Dust coming out sideways. It's got a Vietnamese on one side with his helmets and goggles on, and he's rotating this way, and the other guy's rotating. One's making the gun go up, and the other one's making it go sideways. And I saw a call, make a brilliant call. I say, look out, they're shooting. And of course, that was blocked by somebody else saying the same thing. And so I went, you know, big trouble. So speed solved a lot of problems, so I went full afterburner and started to pull. And as I pulled up, I felt this sickening feeling of the back of the airplane going like that. I'd been hit. And I gotta tell you right here, the only reason I'm here is because I was so close to the 57 millimeter gun emplacement that the round, the shells, were not fusing. They weren't fused yet, so the explosives didn't go off. It was just like a 22 shell that hit me. It didn't go off. If it had of, it would have blown us out of the sky. But nonetheless, we had big fire on the left engine, because it hit this engine coming from this way. And one of my wingmen says, "Jolie, you're on fire." I didn't doubt that in the least, because I could see it in my rearview mirror on the left-hand side. So Mike and I are starting to talk, okay, we're going to do this, I'm going to try to get feet wet, and he says, okay, good, I'm with you all the way. I've turned the handle in the back seat, which means he's going to let me eject both of us, because he always goes out first, sequencing. And so I'm still got both of them in burner, and that's not helping the fire in the left engine very much. So I decided I better pull back the, oh, mill's good enough. So I pulled it back to mill, and I'm starting to see gauges clicking and lights flickering on and up back off. Got a big firelight on the left, and I finally decided I better shut that engine down after all. So I shut that one down, still got the other one in burner, and now I'm starting to get overheat light on the right engine. And I'm saying, well, I'm going to leave it burn for a little while. I can see the coastline, I'm almost there. I'm almost going to get feet wet. So I did, and finally the Valiant F4 gives up the ghost, because it loses hydraulic pressure and it starts going into a little PIO that keeps getting bigger and bigger. And so I'm sure I could time it perfectly so that I pulled the handles when we were at the top. Well, I was looking at the handles when I pulled them, so we weren't at the top, we were at the bottom. But it was probably time anyway. So I pulled the handles, and of course my mind is cranked up full speed, and I'm seeing things and remembering things, and I remember feeling the back canopy behind me go off because the pressure changed and the air moved through the cockpit. And I saw a gold flash go up behind me. That's Mike going up the rail. And then I felt my canopy go, and it seemed like, I don't know, one potato, two potato, and that's a little too long, but that's what it seemed like. And then I got the kick in the pants, up and went up the rail, and I could feel the different temperature air go across my body and my face. And it was really gray. I don't know if I was in that cloud deck or if I was grayed out or what it was, but I remember feeling that, I remember doing kind of a forward roll in the seat. The roll chute on the seat came out, put you down like that, and then the parachute was pulled out. And I made a noise when the parachute opened, something like, oh! Because we were still going pretty fast, it hurt. But unlike training, because in training nothing ever works, and they make you practice what to do when it doesn't work, unlike training, everything worked. The parachute opened up, I looked up, I had all the panels. I didn't have time to do the 4-line cut because I could, we were probably 500 feet even then. And I felt the seat go away. I felt the seat hit the buoy. And hallelujah, when I looked down, the yellow dinghy was full of air. It had automatically filled. That's one thing you pray for. And so then I go, well, okay, Mike's okay. I see him in his parachute. And I go, ooh, we're getting close. So I had to pull my LPUs, the May West, and got those open just before I hit the water. And then, like in training, you know, you hit the water and you get to the top and all that, but I really went deep for some reason. It took forever to get back to the surface. So I'm doing this is what I felt like to get to the surface. But I got to the surface, checked everything, make sure I didn't have anything sharp, pulled the raft to me, did the push under, turn over and flip, pull the survival kit in, get rid of the chute. I got rid of the chute before that. And I got to thinking about it and I said, you know, I just did all those things the way they taught me to without one flaw in my life. Practice.
Okay. Chuck DeBellevue was America's leading ace in Vietnam. Had four aerial victories.
4 MiG-21s and 2 MiG-19s.
Six, sorry, excuse me, sorry, I should know that. Do you want to talk about air-to-air combat in Vietnam?
We were not trained to do what I did. We were trained in air-to-ground. We didn't have a program like the Navy had, the Top Gun at the time. So, and we weren't allowed to fly dissimilar aircraft training in the States. So when I got to Southeast Asia, I was well trained in air-to-ground. And I was in the Triple Nickel Squadron, the 555th Attack Fighter Squadron, which was an air-to-air squadron, but there was not a lot of air-to-air going on. So we did some air-to-ground work. So I was trained for that. Then we started as around March or so, we started doing a lot more air-to-air. We were flying some intercept missions and sitting a lot of air-to-air alert, but there wasn't a lot of combat. That all changed in early '73. And we were doing okay, but not real great. We borrowed 3 F-8s off one of the carriers to come out and fly 2 ships Soviet tactics against us so we could train our crews. And we got them trained, and we started going into Hanoi every day. We would fly a 4-ship, and they would go in a 2-ship. We'd fly a 4-ship, 1 and 3, the lead and alternate lead, maneuvered 2 and 4, through fighting wing behind us to make sure nobody got behind us. And 1 shot and 3 could shoot. And by having restrictions like that, we brought everybody home. We found that when everybody shot, before we had a lot of experience, when everybody shot, nobody checked 6, and we lost some people. But my last combat mission happened on the 9th of September, 1972. We were up by Third Ridge. And the radar control site that was controlling us said, guys, why don't you go down and orbit Phu Quyen? No sane person would do that. Being sane, though, is not a requirement for flying with us. In fact, if you're insane, you probably had a better chance because we were all a little crazy for doing what we did. So we go down, we start heading down from Third Ridge down to, and the reason they call it Third Ridge is because the Thuds used to hide behind it back in the early days of the war because it blocked out the SAM radars. And that was one reason. The other reason was there were a lot of Thuds that were crashed up there. So we headed down, we're just north of Hanoi, just north of Phu Quyen, and number 3 calls out a SAM right 3 o'clock inbound. So we look over to the right, it's not a SAM, it's a MiG-21. It's on final to Phu Quyen, the main MiG-21 base outside, 10 miles outside of Hanoi. I lock onto the MiG with my radar. We fire 2 radar missiles at him. Now this is an old analog radar. If you are looking down at your target and you're close to the ground, the radar will automatically go to the biggest return it sees, which was the ground return, which is at your airspeed. So it transferred locked to the ground. Both missiles hit their target, and earth kills don't count. About that time, we start to turn inbound behind the MiG. Now, we had no idea how slow the MiG was going. We knew he was, they called it the Black Bandit. We color-coded everything. Red, white, and blue bandits, were MiG-17, MiG-19, MiG-21. Black banded was bingo fuel, which meant he was out of gas. Green banded meant he was an ace. So this guy was a black banded. He was short on fuel, and we slowed down to 180 knots in the F4, and it was an old F4D. 180 knots in an F4, at 500 feet off the ground, you better have the gear down. Because you're landing somewhere. We shot past this MiG like he was standing still. Find out later he was doing about 115, 125 knots. As we went by him, I noticed it was one of their brand new MiGs, MiG-21J. And that scared the hell out of me. Because the J Model 21 carried 4 heat seekers, 4 ETOLs, and he had none left. He got rid of all of those. Centerline gas tank, and he got rid of that also. And a 30mm cannon. We ended up out in front of him trying to get back behind him. All this guy had to do was run the airplane over to us and pull the trigger. And he would have been somebody. He didn't do that. Now we're fighting to get back behind him. They told us in training, if we went into a horizontal rolling scissors with another airplane, and you're in an F4, you're going to die. You're going to put the airplane out of control, and you're going to die. But we didn't have any choice. We're in a hard turn, the MiG's turning into us. We did about 3 leaves of this horizontal scissors, and then the MiG's got enough speed, he pulls up out of the fight. The F4, it's a brute force airplane, but it will not accelerate. If you're down at 180 knots, it's not going to accelerate in a hard turn without putting the nose down. We were between 300 and 500 feet off the deck. We didn't want to land at Fujian, and we couldn't turn the F4. So that was out of the question. MiG goes around, and he climbs to the sky. We commit number 3 in. Number 3 was hawking the fight behind us. We commit number 3 in. He fires 2 sidewinders, 2 heat seekers. Both missiles go out, and they head right for the MiG. Where they went, we have no idea, because we didn't detonate it. Well, number 3 had an E model, which has an internal Gatling gun. Gatling gun fires 100 rounds a second. But he has 5.5 seconds worth of bullets. The limit on firing the gun was 3 seconds, because otherwise the barrels get so hot they start warming. He taxis up behind the MiG. MiG's going pretty much straight up. He taxis right behind him. And in training, they want us to break off, to fire at 1,200 feet, break off at 1,000 feet. He got about 500-600 feet behind the guy before he even started to think about shooting. All he had was windscreen in his, MiG is the windscreen, and he fired a short burst to make sure that the bullets were going where the gun sight was pointing, and then he locked the trigger down and emptied the gun. And all you saw around the MiG was these 20mm bullets exploding around him. Finally, the canopy came off and the MiG driver punched out. He was so close to the MiG driver that he almost hit him. Oh, that hell of a way to bring the trophy home. The maintenance guys weren't real happy with him, the way he got the MiG, because they had to change all the barrels and the gun out. And about that time, that MiG's out of the question. We take a big turn up by Thud Ridge, get the flight joined up back and get together again, and cross the River Valley 15 miles west of Hanoi. I picked up one blip on the radar at 8 miles away at 11 o'clock, 30 degrees to the left. We were the last American airplanes in Hanoi. We knew they weren't friendly, and we got to run through them to get home. Luckily, we were high on them. We saw them before they saw us. They were big 19s. We couldn't run. We didn't have gas to run them fast. We had to fight. We turned into them. We had 90 degrees to turn into them when they saw us. We knew they saw us because they punched off their external fuel tanks and did a brake turn into us. MiG-19 is a Korean War version MiG. It's got twin engines. It's hard to fly. They had their best pilots flying it. It could turn on a dime. And these guys did a brake turn into us and the fight was on. We had brand new A9s, A9Js. We had not been through operational tests yet. They sent them to us instead. We fired two heat-seeking missiles, 2 A9Js at the trailing MiG-19. One of them got close enough to detonate and cause him to catch on fire. He left the fight. The other guy was a big threat to us. So we weren't worried about the other guy, the first guy, because he was gone. He just disappeared. We didn't know what happened to him, but he just disappeared. The other guy was making angles on us. It could outturn the F4. We figured we had about 15 seconds before he was going to be bringing his guns to bear. The missile was growling, and we were lagging. From the back canopy, I could see the MiG, which meant we were not in good shape. It was going to hurt. The missile was good to 6 Gs. That's what the book answer was. We had, it was a missile that could pull 40 Gs. So as long as the target was pulling less than 10 Gs, the missile would get it. We had 9 Gs on the airplane when we fired the A9J. It came off, looked like it was going for the sun, which didn't make us very happy. But you know, if you're a duck hunter, you don't shoot the duck, you shoot in front of the duck. So the duck flies into the bullets, the BBs. Well, that's what the missile was doing. It pulled a whole lot of lead because he was in real close, and the MiG was at high G. Next thing you see, the missile comes booking into the MiG. It hits the MiG and the afterburners, the eyelids on the back of the engine. There was an explosion. He went wings level, inverted, did a split S. A split S is a nice acrobatic maneuver. And for the first 90 degrees, it was perfect. But he hit the ground. And he was out of the picture. As soon as he was no longer in the fight, the AAA came up. You could see 23, 37, 57, 85 millimeter anti-aircraft. Each one makes a distinctive flak burst. And they all had us as their center of attention. So if you really wanted attention, this was the place for you. Our number 4 guy was a little high and upside down, trying to get, he was at 2,500 feet, trying to get under all this stuff that was they're shooting at us. And he took a hit in the fuel cells. He left Hanoi with 1,800 pounds. He knew, and we knew, he wasn't going home. We took number 3 and 4 and had them climb straight ahead. And then 1 and 2, we sat behind and read behind them to make sure nobody followed them out. And then when we got out of the high threat areas, we went to the heavens. 3 and 4 went straight ahead. When they got to 1,000 pounds of fuel in number 4, they leveled off. By then they cleaned off the airplanes, and there was nothing external in the jet that they couldn't get rid of, and they ran out of gas. As you've heard, the back seater has the option of either going by himself or taking the front seater out. If the front seater punches out, the back seater always goes first. And these 2 guys had a fight in the cockpit because it's not often you get the chance to pull the handle on a real live ejection seat. So they made individual ejections. And as they were just hitting the silk and in the parachutes, our airborne spare flew over them. He had coordinated the SAR, and they stayed on the ground 20 minutes before we picked them up. We went to the heavens as high as we could go and leaned it out. We were at a fuel state that you could either go to the tanker or go home, but you couldn't do both. You could not go to the tanker and miss him and get home. So we decided not to go to the tanker. We came out of the heavens, max range in the descent. If you bump the engines up just a little bit, the nozzle closes to half its area at the back end of the airplane, and you can get, if you're 40,000 feet, you can go 80 miles. So that's what we did. 40 miles north of Udon is Vientiane, Laos. There's a restricted area around it. It was the boat first to fly over there because that's where the embassies were. They weren't going to do anything to me. I mean, I was already on a short leash. We're going back to Hanoi tomorrow. So we flew about 10,000 feet over Hanoi, over Vientiane, right over downtown. Came into Udon. Intercepted final approach, turned down final approach, short final, got the gear, and touchdown, and I think we cut an engine off just to keep the other one running. Because we didn't have any gas in we were out of gas. We were on fumes. We had to make that landing count because there was no going around. We were so low on gas. But you know, it's just another day at the office.
The next day it flew again.
Yeah.
And the next day it flew again. Okay, well, we've run over, but I wasn't going to say, don't tell the story. So if you want to hear more, please go see them in the tent. And thank you very much, our panelists, and thank you very much for coming to the program.
It's always a pleasure coming here. This is the heartland of America. This is where it's all about. It's not on the coast. These are where the patriots are. Thanks for the patriotism.